Plein Air Magazine, for people who love painting outdoors. pleinairmagazine.com.
Levon and I were talking this morning, and we were talking about varnishing canvases, and we started going into a spiel about the varnishing of canvases, when to do it, and all that stuff. So I thought I would go in and talk about mediums in general, and then varnishes and different things, because today seemed like everybody had a question about what mediums to use, and people had issues with them. So I thought, you know, let's just kind of spend a moment to go through some of the mediums and varnishes, because it's all part of the mystery of painting. First thing, paint is ideal by itself. Paint is completely ideal by itself. So paint is created out of ground up minerals and rock and dirts, different stains. They're ground up, and in that mixture they put in oil, linseed oil. Okay, the linseed oil is what causes the paint to stick and dry. Now that ground up rock that they use to make oil paint, they use the same ground up dirt and rock, and they add gum arabic to it. Gum arabic is a water-based medium, and that's what you make watercolors out of. So the oils are made out of linseed oil. Watercolors are made out of the same product except with gum arabic. So they're exactly the same medium, the same source. Same thing with pastels. They're all the same ground up material. Now there are companies that produce paints that are made with linseed oils, and there are companies that produce paints that use sesame seed oil, and they use walnut oil. Now one of the questions that happened yesterday was from one of my new students here. She was asking about the different kinds of mediums and what we're using, and she's asked about toxic, you know, if oil paintings were toxic. And for the most part, they're not. In fact, a lot of the products that are made now don't even have the minerals and the leads that they used to have. Now, if you remember back in the olden days, artists used to live to be 60 and 70 in an era where most people died at 30 and 40. These artists would sit there with grinders and grind lead-based paints and rocks and things like that, and breathe that dust in. They still use the linseed oil, which is pretty benign. In fact, the linseed oil is pretty much what you find in all of your furniture. And if you are allergic to linseed oil, you would know, because you would not be around their product. Now, there are companies that produce paint with walnut oil. Now, you know, a lot of people are allergic to walnuts. So you would have a problem with people being allergic. So you could break out for that. And a lot of artists wear rubber gloves. I think it's great. They can feel like they're protected from it, but it really doesn't make a big difference. I myself sweat a lot, and I don't necessarily feel comfortable having rubber gloves. Plus, there's no finer brush than the tip of my pinky or the plot of my thumb, and putting a rubber between me and my canvas is not quite the same. Yeah, I like putting my thumbprint on trees to lift the paint just so. So I don't necessarily go for that. What is toxic is turpentine. Now, turpentine is extremely toxic. If you are not allergic to turpentine, you will become so. I used to never have a problem with turpentine, and as I started working with it more and more and more and more, just the smell of it in the room will just absolutely give me a headache and get me buzzy. But the thing is the effect of real turpentine is quite different than the new synthetic turpentines that they have out on the market. So I deal with that. Triple rectified turpentine, and we'll talk about that when we're making our mediums, is really the best turpentine to break down paint. Now we have, let's just take oil paint because that's what we deal with. And so we have oil paint, which is ground stone, and we add linseed oil to it. Now to thin that out, you can just add turpentine to it, and it will make that paint thinner. So there are artists like Richard Schmidt that basically that's all they use is turpentine, and they added but they pretty much work with just the paint by itself. The problem with that is if you keep on adding turpentine to paint to make it thinner and thinner and thinner, you start eliminating the linseed oil, the stuff that sticks paint onto canvas. And eventually there's no more linseed oil left. There's no more binder. So just using turpentine by itself isn't necessarily a good idea. You still want to keep the binder in your paint as you water it down. So you want to add what they make paint out of, which is the linseed oil. So you want to add linseed oil to your turpentine to thin it out. And so usually the recipe for that is 2 turpentine, 1 linseed oil. Okay, now today you were working with linseed oil. Actually, you were working with stand oil, which is a little different. And you were working with pure linseed oil. Now the problem is when you have too much linseed oil, the problem is it gets very sticky and gummy. It's very hard to move, especially since you're using the stand oil. And you didn't have any turpentine in it. And when we added the turpentine, did you notice how fluid it got? So you never use linseed oil all by itself. But the problem is if you just use linseed oil by itself, the problem is you get too much linseed oil, and if you've ever dropped linseed oil in the garage and let it dry, it actually will dry almost like glass. And so when you get that surface like that, you can't put paint on top of it. If you've ever washed, water on top of glass, how it beads up, your paint will actually bead up on top of just a dried surface. So you need X amount of pigment in that paint in order for the paint to adhere onto itself. So you don't want to use pure linseed oil. Okay. Stand oil, which is basically linseed oil, which is more evaporated, that actually levels the paint to create a more sheen. So it's very similar to lacquer. Okay, so you get a very sheeny kind of finish to it. It's a substitute for, it's made out of linseed oil, and artists do use it as part of a medium. So instead of using the linseed oil by itself, they'll use stand oil, and stand oil is, I took it off your thing here, and this is not really true stand oil. So if this were a thing of stand oil, real stand oil, I could go like this, and it would take a minute for the stand oil to drop to the top. It's that syrupy. Okay, so this is...
What is that? Is it a variation of linseed?
Yeah, it's a variation of linseed oil that's basically more evaporated.
What is it called?
Thicker, yes, stand oil. There are artist mediums that use stand oil. And so what you would use is you would use 1 linseed oil, 1 stand oil, and 2 turpentines. So that's another recipe. Okay, it's not too much trouble. It's just mix it together. Okay, so you do get a little bit more of a leveling quality to that. So it's a wonderful.
What point?
You use it to thin down your paints as you're painting. But see, you paint very, like almost right out of the tube. You don't water down your paints any. But there are some artists that like to blend to underpainting. They like to pull the paint. If you're doing lines or detail, you want paint to be very fluid. So you use more liquid in it so that it becomes more fluid. The idea is to try to have the paint come out of the brush. If you're doing that, if you're just painting on, painting with a large flat brush, you don't need the paint to flow. You just need to put the paint on. But if you're using a round brush and you're trying to get detail, you want the paint to flow out of your brush, and you have to add enough medium to it so like a pen, it flows out to the tip and you can make a line. Not enough medium, it jerks. Too much medium and it gets, so the consistency of the mediums become really crucial. Not only that, the finish of the painting is altered, because if you use a stand oil and it starts leveling out a little bit, you get a little bit more sheen. So some artists like a little bit more of a shinier quality. And so consequently, they may use Darmar varnish, and this is where we get into a problem with Darmar varnish and varnishing your paintings. So another recipe that artists do, because they like a little more sheen and they like that real fluid effect on their painting, and they like a little bit more of a blending quality, is that they'll use 1 part linseed oil, again the same product that paint's made out of. They'll use 1 part Damar varnish, and Damar varnish, which comes in a liquid, actually has triple rectified turpentine in it. So it does start getting an odor. And I do not recommend using liquid Damar varnish in a class situation because of the triple rectified turpentine, because it's so potent. Unfortunately, the only way you can make Damar varnish is by melting it, because Damar varnish is actually a sap. Okay? And the only way you can melt that sap to make the varnish is to put it in triple rectified turpentine, which is really strong. And that causes the paint the sap to melt over a long period of time. So you have to have the triple rectified. So you'll have Damar varnish in there with some turpentine, and then you might have 2 turpentines on top of that. So you have linseed oil, Damar varnish, and then 2 turpentines. And so you'll have 3 to 2, yeah.
I made up some several years ago when I was using a medium, and then I went back and I got it open, and the odor just knocked me off my chair.
Yeah, that little bit of,
It's unusable.
yeah, that little bit of Damar varnish. And that's the reason why most people don't paint in oils, because of the turpentine. The smell is so bad. It does cause headaches. And if you're getting headaches and things from painting, it's because of your turpentine. Now, the turpentine that you buy in the hardware store is the worst. That's, again, really horrible stuff. It's made with no health concerns whatsoever, and it should never be used in painting. And if you're buying odorless turpentine in the hardware store, you're fooling yourself. You live in a fool's paradise, because you're still breathing in the fumes, but you just don't smell them. So you're going to get the same toxicity. So consequently, there are paint companies that have come onto the market that have produced terpenoids and odorless thinners and stuff like that, that are actually reformulated so that artists, and primarily it's because of the craft market, toll painters required having a turpentine that they could use in a kitchen, because they paint in home environments. And so they came across with Turpenoid, Grumbacher's brand, Mona Lisa brand odorless thinner, which I highly recommend, and then Gamsol, which is the Rolls Royce of all of the odorless thinner. Gamsol smells so, it doesn't smell at all. It's almost like you could accidentally drink it because it's that odor, less of odor. But if you're allergic to turpentines, those are the ones that you want to use. They're actually formulated not to evaporate so quickly, so you're not breathing in all of those chemicals. So consequently, in a class environment, we don't want to use the Damar varnish whatsoever. That brings us into our liquins. Liquin is a new product that's been, it's a petroleum-based product. It's primarily produced by Winsor Newton. And the reason why Liquin was manufactured in the first place is that the old mediums that the artists used to use was a recipe called Maroger medium. Maroger was actually a scientist that was trying to figure out what did Titian and some of the early painters use in their old paintings. Now, when we go to the museums, you see these incredible paintings and these wonderful colors. And, mediums do change the quality of the paint. Mediums do change the quality of the paint. And we'll get into that in a sec, because it's interesting when you think of watercolors and oils, and I'll show you why mediums make a big difference. But Maroger was trying to figure out, what did these old masters use to get that vibrant color, those beautiful colors? And the artists back then would experiment. So artists knew that they would have paint, but then they wanted to outdo each other. So if you could come up with a better recipe and have your paint more vibrant, the Pope would hire you to do more church paintings. So it was a business back then. And if you could come up with a way that was painted differently than everyone else by changing the medium a little bit, you would be rich. Okay, so artists would always play around, and there were artists that wouldn't deliver their paintings for quite some time. because they didn't want to have other artists walk up to their canvas and go, you used, you know, so they would actually make sure there was no more odor of the products that they would use. So it was really a guarded secret. So consequently, a lot of these secrets had actually disappeared. Maroger, actually, the scientist, tried to figure out, and he figured out that they would actually use black oil, which is made out of walnut oil or linseed oil that has been baked with lead. Okay. And they bake it for 3 days. Now, lead when you buy it, lead carbonate when you buy it is white. And you bake it at a temperature. Now, in the olden days, they would sit there for 3 days and bring it right up to almost a boil, and they would add a drop of water in. And because oil and water don't mix. And they would temper the temperature at just below boiling. Any higher, it would explode. And so they would temper this for 3 days so that the oil would turn black. So they used black oil, and then they would use mastic tears. Very much similar to Damar Varnish, still a sap. And they would mix those two together, and once those two products came together, it would form a thick liquid. Very similar to the liquid that you would buy in Liquin. So if you ever see the Liquin jar and you turn it upside down, you usually have to pound it to have the liquid come out. That's kind of the consistency that they would strive to get. Thicker the better. And what happens is that and the Liquin does this too, is that it separates your paint. Now, real quickly, so imagine these being paint particles. And so you would have a lot of this liquid or linseed oil. That's one reason why oil paints are so beautiful, is that all of that is transparent goo. Okay, and light can penetrate through it. That's why oil paintings are so vibrant, okay, attractive. Acrylic, on the other hand, acrylic is a water-based medium, and when the water evaporates, there's nothing left. So what happens to the paint particles in acrylic is that they start connecting each other to each other, forming a flat surface. Okay? So this becomes a flat surface that doesn't really allow light through it. This becomes much more brilliant. So what people say, what's the difference between oil paints and acrylics? That's the difference. Now, acrylic artists will argue and fight with me and go, but you can make acrylics look like oils, but you have to use this, and then you have to paint several layers of it, and then you have to like do this, and it's like, why?
Why not use oil?
Why? Because you could still buy oil paint. As far as I know, it hasn't gone up in price. It's not like the price of gold where you would replace gold with leafing. You know, there's a huge difference between 24 karat gold leaf and foil. You know, but with oil paints, it's almost the same price. So you have to work a lot harder to try to get your acrylic paints to have that same luminous glow as oil paints. And so artists were trying to figure out if we would increase the goo around our paint particles, how much more luminous it would be. So Maroger came up with this medium where it would be much more vibrant. It's almost like it would turn on or plug in the paintings, making the reds and the yellows so much more vibrant, so that these paintings, they could duplicate the paintings that they did in the old museums like they would see. Unfortunately, that recipe kind of went aside, and Winsor Newton came back and they said, hey, we've got this cool thing, petroleum product, let's see if we could do something with it, and they came out with Liquin. Liquin was actually made to replace the Maroger medium. Now, rather than blowing up your house and trying to make a Maroger medium and working with lead carbonate and over 3 days, and I've done the recipes and they're wonderful, but you don't need to do that. You can go down and pick up Liquin. Okay, Liquin is a wonderful, stable product. It is produced in several consistencies. In fact, they even have it now in a tube. Liquin comes in very watered down version, so you can get it more fluid. You can have it thicker. I don't necessarily see the benefit of having all those. Remember, paint companies are constantly trying to come up with new colors and new things to get money out of your pocket. So I would just say the standard Liquin is good, but if you like the more fluid stuff, then hey, buy that. Gamblin, which is definitely in the business to try to beat Liquin out there, has come out with their little solvent-free gel, you know, so everybody's trying to do the health conscious thing. But this basically is, again, very thick gel, and several companies have it. In fact, Grumbacher's had a gel for many, many years trying to get the same effects that the old Maroger mediums. But basically, all of these companies, what they're trying to do is they're trying to suspend the paint particles so that you get more light into your oil paintings. Okay. So when you go into a museum, that's why those old paintings look the way that they do. Now, so by using the Liquin, you can actually almost duplicate that quality, but a lot of artists don't bother with that. A lot of artists say, you know, we don't need trickery, we just will do really good painting. So in the process of doing that, you end up with a finished product. Now what do you do with it? Well, pretty much you can just frame it and hang it up. Okay? But the problem is that it's exposed to the elements, paint can get dirty, so we feel like we have to put a finish on it. So there are a lot of different varnishes out on the market, but one of the most standard varnishes, and the one I recommend, is Damar Varnish. Damar Varnish is actually, again, tears, sap, soaked in triple rectified turpentine. So when you use Damar Varnish, it's very lethal. It has that varnish. So if you've ever sprayed Damar Varnish or worked with Damar Varnish, you're getting the hit of what triple rectified turpentine smells like. Now on the can, when you pick up the Damar Varnish, it's not it, but on the can it says, wait 1 year before applying. So I don't know what artist has the kind of resources to wait around for a year to varnish their painting before a show. Pretty much companies put rules on cans because some artists work with cadmium red with palette knives, really thick. And it takes a year just to get a shell on some of those paints. A lot of artists paint very, very thin, and within a week or two, those surfaces are completely dry. Now, we talked earlier that we could put Damar Varnish into our paint. So putting Damar Varnish on top of the paint isn't that much of a leap. So there's no reason why you can't put Damar Varnish on top of a painting if it's dry enough. Now, I would recommend, if your painting is just dry, not to buy the liquid form of Damar Varnish and paint it on. Because if you've got little spots that aren't dry, they will start bleeding. Okay? So that's one of the reasons why they recommend not to, wait a long period of time before it's dry. But if you spray your varnish on, you're perfectly fine. In fact, I did a painting for Levon this week, and I finished it last week, and I sprayed it day before yesterday. Only waited a week. She'll never have a problem. I've sprayed my paintings consistently all my artist's life for 30 years with Damar Varnish, and the painting was still wet, barely. I mean, like according to the can, and they were perfectly fine. There's no reason why you have to wait unless you're going to damage the surface. If it's dry to the touch, you can spray it with no problem. The key to spraying varnish is empty out the can to the point that you think you've done too much, and then let it sit straight. The problem with people who spray Damar Varnish on their paintings is that they put a little on and then they go have a cigarette. And then they come back and they put a little on and then they go have a cup of coffee. And then the next day they put a little on, And the problem is you end up with all these stripes, okay? The way that you varnish your paintings, you lay it flat on a newspaper. You count on overspraying. You want to spray from paper to paper, not from edge of the painting to the edge of the painting. And you want to spray, 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 spray.
It's not going to run?
Spray. No, you're going to lay it flat. Okay. The thing what you want to do is get that product on there really thick. On some of the larger canvases, I would dump half the can of Damar Varnish in one sitting. Okay. Because what that does is that it levels out, and you have to do it all in, kind of a warmish kind of temperature, and just let it level out. If you don't have enough on there, it won't level out. You get a kind of a splotchy surface. If you look at it and you start seeing areas, because like burn umber and dark areas tend to not grab varnish, or they grab too much of varnish, you want to spray over those at that time. You know, so if you see the trees and they're not really getting as shiny as your sky, then go over that a few more times too. The more you can get it to level and be even at the beginning, the much more smoother finish that you'll have at the end. You don't want to have to go back, because if you have these streaks in there, you will never get rid of them, because every time you do it again, those streaks get shinier and shinier, and the rest of it is trying to keep up. So you can ruin a painting that way. One good thing about Damar varnish, and the reason why we use Damar varnish as a finish as opposed to Liquin, you can use Liquin as a finish, and it is a really good finish. But once you put Liquin on, it's unremovable. The reason why we use Damar varnish as a varnish when we're done is, remember when we started our talk, I said you use Damar varnish and turpentine, triple rectified turpentine, to make the mastic seal, the mastic, that's mastic tears, to make the Damar varnish crystals melt. Okay, so Damar varnish melts with turpentine, triple rectified turpentine. If your painting is sitting around in your studio for 30 years and they want to clean it, what they do is they take triple rectified turpentine again and they start melting the Damar varnish again. Okay, and they can take the varnish off and get back to the original painting. So a lot of the paintings that you see renovated, they actually do that. They lift the Damar varnish back off. And so they just have to melt it back in. And sometimes if you messed up your painting with the varnishing like that, you can actually take triple rectified turpentine in a clean cloth, and you can actually start melting. That's how professionals handle that. So, any questions about mediums? Yeah.
Walnut oil?
Walnut oil is a substitute for linseed oil. It has a little bit more of a sheen to it. If you're allergic to walnuts, you wouldn't want to use walnut oil. I don't necessarily see the difference between one or the other, but some people like the difference. It has a little bit more of a glossier finish, and so it doesn't. They do make walnut oil even as a medium that you can add to your
Does
turbs.
it matter if you use different mediums? Like I use one here and then a different one at home.
No, unless you're really anal about that stuff. You want to, yeah.
Okay, so if you've used Liquin to thin parts of the paint, so like the forest I did, it's got some shiny trees.
Yeah.
Can you then varnish it? When is it going to stay parts of it shiny? Or?
When you put the Damar varnish on and you notice that that's staying shiny, you can at that point control putting more varnish on the rest of the painting to even it out. You'll never quite get them 100%, but you'll get a good clean finish. It's one thing about getting that Damar varnish on top of everything that's flat. It's about that finish coat that counts, not so much in between. But if you're using medium, you want to be kind of consistent throughout the whole painting. You know, don't do half the painting with no medium and then start doing really glossy, thick, medium-based paint on the. There will be a difference between the textures and stuff like that. So.